Do you have questions about Irish bards? Well, Dagdi Vogus Fulcha. Hi, hello, and welcome. Jon O'Sullivan from the Irish Pagan School. And you're not alone in those questions. In fact, I have two questions here inspired by recent Bard content that we've released on our channel from a community member by the name of Kira. And I thought they're really well laid out questions, really, really great ones. And I thought I'd just read them straight to you and do my best to answer them for you. So the first question Kira had was, did the notion of heritable skills factor into Gaelic Irish society in terms of what was expected from a person? Today, when there's a common thread of skill amongst family members, people say it's in their blood. We usually think about this in terms of genetics today, but how might that have been understood before genetics became common knowledge? Was it simply a matter of who raised you and how? I've heard in your classes that kings, for example, were not selected through heritage, and I wondered if it was the same for bards. Well, really, really great question. Very well laid out. And there's a number of different things I can definitely speak to from this. So, the concept of heritable skills is abilities or skills that are passed down in bloodline or lineage. Now, when we talk about bards in Irish tradition, in the ancient Irish manuscripts, there was actually almost a biological difference when we talked about bards. There was two things that were notable about bards. One was said that their tongue had, it wasn't just charming or silver-tongued, they actually had extra parts in their tongue, one which would give honeyed words and the other which would give poisonous satire. And it's known as mulla agus as in praising words or satire words. Also, it was said that there was a vein of poetry that existed in the back of a bard's skull. And so, for true bards to interact with poetry and to embrace or to connect with deeper concepts of poetry, they needed to lie in darkness on the ground with the back of their head pressed against the ground and close their eyes. And the whole purpose of this vein of poetry was that it existed in the place that the eyes can never perceive. And it is true then that poetry actually flows around the bard's body. So there was this belief that there was some biological importance when it came to your heritage and how that defined your skills. We have many stories where people list their lineage, like they are a person descended from this person, descended from this person. And in a lot of those cases, those heritages and lineages in the case of the kings, for example, you had to at least have your great grandfather had to also have been a king, which means that just because your father was a king doesn't mean you're guaranteed to be the next king or queen. It was open to anyone who had the same great grandfather could put their name forward, and then they were judged on their merits, judged for how they deal with the community. And interestingly, there was also an extra element to that. There was personal excellence. So an individual had to have their own display of personal excellence to be selected. Something similar did exist for bards, but it wasn't just always based on lineage and based, oh well, what your dad was a bard, you're going to be a bard. There was also kind of spontaneous eruptions or alterations to a person that could lead them to receiving the gift of bardic talent. There's a concept in our mythology and well in our spirituality as well, I guess. It's known as Imbos Pharasna, which is the knowledge which enlightens. And this was something that a bard had to be able to access to show and prove their detail of skill to become like the best of bards, the upper tier caste of bard known as a fili. You had to be able to interact with this knowledge that enlightens. And it's like inspiration. It's like divine inspiration or just magical inspiration. Um, but some people could just access that through other means. Interestingly enough, the Irish hero Fionn McCool, when he puts his thumb upon the blister on the salmon of knowledge caught from the River Boyne and then sucks his thumb because he burns it, the salmon itself carries access to all knowledge. The salmon itself carried access to Imbos Pharasna. And so by him doing that, he gained access to Imbos Pharasna. So we have so many stories of Fionn McCool in later life when he's confused about something, doesn't know what way to go, he puts his thumb into his mouth, and that is his trigger, that is a mimetic trigger for him to be able to engage with this knowledge that enlightens. So yes, there was a heritage, there was lineage, from family line. Ancient Irish society was very tribal and very caste based. So there were people who fulfilled certain roles within the tribe society, and if you were brought up in a particular caste, you generally lived and died within that caste, unless you could display some form of excellence in a craft or a skill or an art, like a poet, for example, or a bard, then becoming a fili, that allowed some people to move into upper caste within society. Also, it was possible for people to have their caste within society removed from them. Just because you were born into what was known as the Sir Nemeth, the upper caste in society, doesn't mean you're guaranteed to stay there. Because if your behavior, if your representation or function for a tribal circumstance was not in keeping with the right values, you could have a satire placed against you. And a legally recognized satire performed publicly by a bard would be enough to remove someone's status. There's stories of kings being toppled because they didn't provide proper hospitality in keeping with Irish custom and law, and that a satire legally was presented and placed against them, and that removed them from their caste. They were no longer fit to be king. Or in the extremist form, there's stories of bards or fillas, specifically of filla in this instance. They would take a hold of someone's earlobe, in public in front of the tribe, and they would then speak out loud the satire, which would confirm why this person has pretty much offended or broken faith with or broken with the keeping and customs of the tribe. And so that it's not that they're no longer fit within a particular caste, they could actually be cast out of the tribe entirely, in which case they're no longer recognized of the people in that way. And in some cases, they'd be put on a boat and put off the island, literally off the island, with no oars, knowing that the tide would wash them back up on the island. And so there was a legally recognized status for pretty much tribeless people who could be deemed as property and then taken in for indentured servitude for their life because they're not of a people, because they've been cast out for some particular reason. So there was a lot of power and a lot of function that went along with that. But you didn't have to be descended from a line of bards in order to become a bard. But a lot of bards were also descended from lineages of bards. So, in answering that first question, it's both. Interestingly, though, it's not always just down to the skill that you're raised with. One of the most important figures to look to for that is the Ildonach himself, Lu, the god of the Tuatha De Danann, who is he of the many interlinked talents. So he was saved from the sea by Monaghan MacLear, and he was placed with a Firbolg woman actually called Talchu. And there he learned not just one skill or one talent, he learned all of the skills and talents and was able to interconnect them all together, which is why he earned the title Eel Donach, he of many interlinked talents. So there was a lot to be said around your heritage and where you came from and how that would influence on you. Like it's in their blood was quite common and well understood. But also that wasn't the only way. There was other stories and opportunities where people would be born with bardic like born or have in some way a spiritual interaction of some kind, which would then give them access to bardic knowledge or deeper bardic feats, shall we say. Which I suppose leads us into the second question, which I'll read out for you now. How might one distinguish a calling, a vocation, or inclination generally towards being a bard versus being a druid? My understanding of being a druid is that it comes with an implied responsibility to serve one's community, and that it takes many years of tutelage before such a title can be responsibly claimed. As for bards, is it as simple as being good with words, stories, and song, and wanting to inspire others using that craft? Or is there another feeling that directs someone towards being a bard? Um, we know from the information that people who had or were born into lineages or heritable skills of bardic practice were trained. They were sent to the same school, like Cashel Monaghan in Connacht, in the Rathcroghan complex, for example. People who had the bardic lineage were sent to the same school as Druids and the same school as Brehons. So within the tribal society, The Brehons were the ones who kept the law and gave the judgments. The Druids were the ones who studied the natural philosophies, the spirit, like the sciences of the energy of the world and the spirits around them. And the bards are the ones who studied memory. They became a function of memory for their people. They studied all of the old stories, all of the old judgments, all of the information. In fact, if a Brehon was to give a judgment, a bard was usually there to recall the story of the judgment because in ancient Irish society, there was no written script. No one was writing records like that. There was the Ogham script, but that was used for boundary marking and magical practice. It wasn't used for listing out the shopping list, for example. Um, so a bard was pretty much always present, and it was very important to have bards. And at the upper status, known as the Sernemid within a tribe, one of the chief functions was known as the fili, who was pretty much the best bard in the tribe. And their role wasn't just to remember stories and entertain. Their role was to remember the history, the lineage, the descendancy of everyone in the tribe, to remember the history of the tribe and perform it and speak to it. When there was a gathering known as an Éineach, where a king or a chieftain would call for a intertribal meeting, the first thing that would happen was each tribe's fila would step forward and they would announce the heritage, the lineage. This is my chieftain descended from here, descended from here, descended from here. And they'd have to go back about four generations to justify who was this person coming to the Éineach and why they have a right to speak at that Éineach, at that meeting of kings and chieftains. If the fila wasn't able to do that, then the person's wish to speak amongst the chieftains and kings would be declined because they're not shown to have the proper lineage, proper kind of caste system to warrant their voice to be heard within the Enoch. So the role of the fila, as much as this question here is about can anyone just step in and be a bard, there was a lot more responsibility because the bards and the storytellers didn't just function as entertainment or creative arts or songwriting or poetry. Everything functioned along the lines of memory, providing story, providing context, providing information about the rulings of the Brehons. A lot of the stuff that we have, there's a law document in Irish manuscripts known as the Brehon, and it lists out all of these, this happened here, or this. There was this kind of offense that happened here, and this is how it was resolved by a Brehon. The only reason we have those stories to be written down by the manuscripts was that they were remembered by the storytellers. So it wasn't just a case of, oh, let me entertain you. Every single story was, and here's the moral of the story. Here's the teaching of the story. Here's the judgment that was given. Here's the why the mountain is named this mountain. So the role of the bard, like trained in the same school as Druids, trained in the same schools as Brehons, it was serious business because it wasn't just functioning as memory. There were also particular forms and rhythms and rhymes that had to be met in meter when someone was giving certain performances. You couldn't just rock up and go, "Oh yeah, I'm John, son of Jack and Carmel, son of Ned and Mary," and that'd be it. It was like, no, there was a particular meter, a rhythm, a rhyme, a flow, a poetic expression that had to be met. So it was complex and it was very, very detailed. And so the idea of, oh, the barbaric, like, thick, paddy Irishman that was later put upon us by people who colonized us is a serious falsehood when we can look back at manuscripts from the 8th and ninth century linguistically, which show a very complex form of poetry known as Rosk poetry. Um, so all of the information, all of these stories that eventually made it into the manuscript tradition that we have still to us now were told by storytellers, were told by bards, were told by fila. The memory of the entire tribe, the heroes, the landscape, the rivers, everything was carried on, the stories as told by bards and fila. So to really kind of go back to Kira's question on this, could anyone just choose to simply say, "Oh, I'm good at words. I'm going to be a bard"? They could, to be honest. There's nothing stopping anyone doing that. But the word, much like you said with the Druid above, to claim before they claim such a title responsibly, there is a bit more to be understood about the practices and what's involved because bards do have a service to their community. Bards function as a sketch, not just to entertain, but also to educate and also to enlighten with the stories, and then to witness. The bard was the witness to everything, and their job was to remember what was said, what was done, how it was witnessed, and then document that down so that it could be kept, it could be notified, and that the future generations could learn from it. So there's a lot involved in being a bard if you want to step deeply into the tradition of that. And I haven't even got into the deep episodes about satire. I did some more other videos about bards, being a bard, and then bardic satire on our platforms in YouTube and podcasts and such. And so maybe look those up. But satire was very serious business. It wasn't just, I'm going to take the mick out of these people. Satire was used to keep power in check. No one was above satire. No one was above the law around what satire. As I said, chieftains and kings could be toppled by declaring them unfit for purpose, and the person who witnessed it, educated around it, and then declared it was the bard. So I refer to myself as the Dagda Bard in that the stories I tell are centered around the Dagda, the god of the Tuatha Danann that I work for. But I understand the deeper meaning of what a bard is supposed to be and how they're supposed to, yes, absolutely entertain, but also educate, also witness, and also call out abuses of power where they're not supposed to be. So these are really great questions, Kira. Thank you very much for taking the time to type them out and to explore it with it. I'm really, really delighted that our content has stimulated these questions for you and that you're exploring it deeper. Um, Being a bard is pretty serious business, and anyone who would just claim it willy-nilly just because, or just because they're interested, or because they feel they're entitled to it, that happens too. But those who want to live in an honest and responsible, as you said, Kira, responsibly take on the title of being a bard, will honor the responsibility that goes with serving your community in that function, to be the witness, to be the support structure, and then to call out abuses of power where it is seen to occur. So hopefully this has been interesting. As I said, I'm delighted whenever these questions come up. I'm honored to, take the time to answer that to the best of my ability. If anything is unclear about this, if Kira does come back and see this video and wants further clarification, or if you are interested and inspired by anything you see in our content anywhere at all, throw a comment in. If I can make the time to do it, I will definitely give a response to it, because the more questions we have, the more likely we're able to answer those questions, and everyone then benefits from the sharing of that knowledge and that information. So, speaking of knowledge and information, don't forget we have over a year's worth of free resources at the Irish Pagan School, irishpagan.school/free. And no, I don't have a free class. No, I do. There's videos. If you go into our YouTube channel, wherever you're coming across this content, and just search for being a bard, or go into the Irish Pagan School and search the word bard, you might find more information. Bard, poetry, satire, I think are your keywords there. So until next time, look after yourself. Take care. August Slán. Goodbye.